Callia Morgen was the last person anyone in Fairbridge suspected. An ordinary mother of two, always seen pushing a stroller with sleepy-eyed Kiel and bright, curious Seren by her side. But when Seren was found dead in her own bed, and Callia pointed a trembling finger at her 2-year-old son, the horrifying unravelling began. What seemed like a tragic accident soon twisted into a chilling tale of deceit, premeditation, and a mother's dark obsessions with control. In the quiet town of Fairbridge, mornings were usually calm, predictable, and uneventful. The streets were lined with tall oak trees, the kind that turned orange in autumn and dropped leaves like confetti across every yard. Most people in the neighbourhood knew each other by name, or at least by routine. Every day, around 7:30 a.m., joggers passed the same mailboxes. Dog walkers nodded to the same retired couples, and children waited by the same driveways for the school bus. But on the morning of October 11th, everything changed when the calm was broken by flashing lights, sirens, and a single haunting call to 911. Callia Morgen was the one who made the call. She lived in a modest beige house at the end of Crescent Lane with her 2 children, 5-year-old Seren and 2-year-old Kiel. Her voice, when she spoke to the emergency dispatcher, was flat but rushed. She said her daughter wasn't breathing. She said she didn't know what had happened. When paramedics arrived minutes later, they found Seren lying on her small twin bed, still in her pink pyjamas. Her tiny frame was motionless, lips a pale, bluish-purple. Attempts at resuscitation began immediately. An oxygen mask was placed over her face, CPR was administered, and the EMTs worked silently but urgently. Despite their best efforts, they pronounced Seren dead at the scene. Callia stood nearby, not crying, not screaming, just watching. A few neighbours gathered outside, murmuring and exchanging worried looks. No one knew what to say. No one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. Seren had been seen just the previous afternoon, playing with chalk on the driveway, drawing shapes and scribbling her name in lopsided letters. She had been full of energy, skipping and laughing, never once showing signs of illness or distress. Her sudden death stunned everyone. Callia told officers she had put both children to bed around 8 Ward p.m., just like always. Nothing unusual, no strange noises, no visitors. She claimed that when she checked on Seren in the morning, she wasn't breathing. The first responders were troubled. The child's body had visible bruising, some on her arms, others near her jawline. There was slight swelling on her cheek. The position she was found in didn't suggest a medical issue or natural death. There was a plastic toy nearby, a baby doll missing an arm, but nothing else out of place in the room. Kiel, the 2-year-old brother, was found unharmed in his crib in the next room, playing with a soft stuffed animal and looking confused by the commotion. Though detectives were called in immediately, they initially treated the home as a potential accident scene. They took photos, collected bedding, clothing, and anything else that could be useful. But it was hard to ignore the unease in the air. Something about the environment didn't sit right with the investigators. The house felt sterile, cleaner than expected for a home with 2 toddlers. As officers asked Callia more questions, her answers became more robotic. She said she'd been under stress lately, juggling childcare and finances, but didn't elaborate. She said Seren sometimes sleepwalked. Maybe she fell and hit her head. She floated the idea that maybe Kiel had climbed into her sister's bed and rolled over her during the night. The officers didn't push hard right away, but they took notes. They noticed what she emphasized and what she left out. By the end of the day, Seren's body had been transported to the coroner's office for autopsy. Kiel was taken temporarily into protective custody for evaluation. No charges were filed, no arrests were made. But behind the scenes, the wheels of suspicion had begun to turn. The case was far from closed, and in a town like Fairbridge, where everyone believed monsters lived elsewhere, the truth was slowly waking up behind closed doors. The day after Seren Morgen's death, whispers began to circulate through the town of Fairbridge. At first, people assumed it was a terrible accident or an unexpected medical condition, the kind of tragic event that sometimes claims the life of a child without warning. But those closest to the case, particularly the detectives assigned to, it felt something was deeply wrong. The bruises on Seren's body weren't just concerning. They were suspicious. Uniform in shape and placement, they hinted at force, not falling. The medical examiner noted them carefully, making quiet annotations on her clipboard as the autopsy began. When the preliminary results came back, the findings sent a ripple through the investigative team. Seren had died from asphyxiation. There were signs of pressure applied to her mouth and nose, and tiny broken blood vessels in her eyes, classic signs of suffocation. There was also a more recent bruise on her ribcage, possibly from blunt force. The conclusion was clear. Seren had not died naturally. She had been killed. Detectives returned to the Morgen house that afternoon, this time with a different approach. What had started as a sudden death investigation was now a full-blown homicide case. Callia, still wearing the same sweatshirt from the day before, sat on her living room couch, arms crossed, eyes distant. She didn't ask questions. She didn't cry. She just waited. When questioned again, her responses had changed slightly. Her voice remained calm, but now she suggested something no one was prepared for. She told investigators that she believed her 2-year-old son, Kiel, might have been responsible for Seren's death. She said she had found him in Seren's bed earlier that morning, lying beside her, and that maybe he had rolled onto her during the night. Or perhaps, she said, he had smothered her accidentally while trying to cuddle. The detective stared at her, silent for a moment. The idea seemed preposterous. A toddler barely past his 2nd birthday, causing the kind of fatal injuries found on Seren's body. It didn't align with the science, the evidence, or common sense. But Callia didn't flinch. She spoke of Kiel's behavior in recent weeks, how he'd become unpredictable, aggressive, and unusually strong for his age. She mentioned once finding him hitting his sister with a plastic toy, and another time pulling her hair so hard she cried. To the untrained ear, it sounded plausible. Maybe there was something wrong with Kiel. Maybe he didn't know his own strength. But the detectives were trained to spot misdirection. They noted how quickly Callia volunteered this theory, how prepared she seemed to answer follow-up questions. There was no sign of emotional hesitation in her delivery. Most mothers, when asked about the loss of a child, broke down. But Callia remained steady, and that steadiness felt unnatural. They reached out to Kiel's daycare provider, who described him as quiet, gentle, and unusually attached to his sister. there had never been reports of aggression. If anything, Seren acted as a protective older sibling. She was often seen helping him with puzzles or holding his hand when they played outdoors. The teachers found the suggestion that Kiel had hurt his sister deeply disturbing. With this new information, the investigative team shifted focus entirely. A forensic pathologist confirmed that the force needed to inflict the pressure marks found on Seren could not have been delivered by a toddler. Kiel lacked the weight, size, and motor coordination necessary. The bruising pattern on Seren's body told a different story, one of adult involvement. Investigators also brought in a child psychologist to observe Kiel. He was non-verbal due to his age, but showed no signs of trauma or aggression. He played quietly with toys, responded to his name, and seemed especially comforted by soft music. The psychologist's conclusion was firm. The child displayed no behavioral tendencies that would support the claim Callia had made. Now the attention turned inward. Why would a mother accuse her toddler son of such a crime? Was it panic, desperation, or something much darker? Was this an impulsive cover-up, or had it been carefully calculated? Either way, the image of a grieving mother was quickly fading, and in its place stood a woman who had just pointed the finger at the only other person in the room that night, her own innocent child. The case against Callia Morgen took a sharp turn once detectives obtained a warrant to search her digital devices. With Seren's death now ruled a homicide, and Callia's accusations against her 2-year-old son falling apart under scrutiny, the investigative team knew they needed more than medical reports and witness statements. They needed a motive, or at the very least, a deeper look into Callia's state of mind. Her phone was the first to be analysed. It was a standard smartphone with basic apps, but what caught the attention of investigators was the browser history. Though some of the data had been recently deleted, forensic software retrieved several alarming searches. Less than a week before Seren's death, Callia had typed phrases like, "How long can a child survive without air?" and ways to make a child pass out quickly. She had clicked on message board threads discussing parental frustration, and had even bookmarked one article with the chilling headline, "Smothering Deaths That Go Undetected." Investigators also found late-night activity on her device, especially in the early morning hours when the rest of the house would have been asleep. During these sessions, she had scrolled through forums where anonymous users shared stories of child abuse, some disguised as venting, others far more sinister. In one forum, a user with a profile matching Callia's email posted, "I love my son, but hate my daughter. Every day I look at her, I see everything that went wrong." The post was dated 2 nights before Seren's death. Detectives turned their attention to her laptop, which was initially locked with a password. After some digital digging, they found the key and unlocked a set of hidden files. Inside was a private journal, a collection of typed entries with timestamps stretching back over a year. What they read painted a portrait of a woman unraveling. In the journal, Callia described her resentment toward motherhood, particularly toward Seren. She wrote about feeling trapped and invisible, and how she blamed her daughter for things that had gone wrong in her life, missed job opportunities, the breakdown of her past relationship, and the growing financial pressure of single parenting. There were entries describing vivid dreams in which she lived alone with Kiel, free from Seren's constant demands. One entry was especially disturbing. "I imagine how peaceful it would be if she just didn't wake up tomorrow." For the prosecution, the digital evidence was gold. It not only showed premeditation, but also a dangerous mindset. They brought in a digital forensic expert who confirmed the files had not been altered or planted. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the timeline leading up to Seren's death. To further strengthen their case, investigators contacted a behavioral analyst who reviewed the journal and search history. The analyst noted that Callia's obsession with control was a red flag. Her desire to remove Seren from her life, combined with her cold reaction after the incident, aligned with profiles of parents who commit filicide, not in a moment of uncontrollable rage, but with calculated intent. Meanwhile, in her interviews, Callia remained emotionless. She didn't ask about the investigation's progress. She didn't request updates on Kiel. When confronted with the search history, she initially claimed she had no memory of those queries. Later, she said she had searched those terms out of curiosity after watching a crime documentary. Her explanations lacked consistency, and her body language during questioning was described by officers as detached and rehearsed. While most of Fairbridge mourned the loss of a child and tried to understand how such a thing could happen, investigators were beginning to understand exactly how and why. The clues weren't just in bruises or testimony. They were embedded in data, hidden behind logins and encryption. What they had found was no longer just evidence. It was a confession in pieces. And each click, each entry, each chilling sentence was pushing the truth closer to the surface. The investigation closed in around Callia Morgen. The quiet town of Fairbridge watched with morbid fascination. The media had caught wind of the story. A mother accused of blaming her toddler son for the murder of his older sister, and headlines exploded across local news stations. Neighbours who once waved politely at Callia during school drop-offs now avoided speaking her name. But behind the closed doors of the police department, something new had surfaced, something that deepened the mystery and added a layer of shock no one had expected. While reviewing financial records, detectives noticed Callia had recently taken out a small life insurance policy on Seren. The policy had been approved just 3 months prior to the child's death. It wasn't a large sum, just under $15,000, but it was enough to raise eyebrows, especially when they discovered the policy on Kiel was half that amount. Investigators contacted the insurance company, confirming Callia was the sole beneficiary. The policy had no accidental death rider, meaning it would only be paid in the event of natural death or illness. But it was still an odd move. Why insure only one child at a higher rate, especially when Callia's financial situation was unstable? Digging deeper, detectives learned that Callia had recently applied for several high-interest payday loans. She had also been behind on rent for the last 2 months, facing the risk of eviction. Her internet history included searches for quick cash after family death. And how long does insurance take to pay out for a child? When combined with the journal entries and her questionable behaviour, this painted a much darker picture than mere neglect or frustration. Now, motive had a financial thread. Investigators also reviewed surveillance footage from nearby stores and public locations in the days leading up to Seren's death. At a local pharmacy, Callia was seen purchasing over-the-counter sedatives. The receipt, dated 2 days before the murder, showed children's allergy medicine in large quantities, enough to sedate a small child if used improperly. The bottle was found later in her bathroom cabinet, nearly empty. When tested, it matched the same sedative compounds found in Seren's toxicology report. It became clear. Seren had been drugged before she was suffocated. This revelation made the timeline even more damning. The sedative was likely used to ensure Seren wouldn't struggle or wake up while Callia carried out the murder. It showed planning. It showed control. It proved that what had happened to Seren was not spontaneous or accidental. It was deliberate. As detectives assembled their case, they also focused on protecting Kiel. He was placed with a temporary foster family who had experience dealing with trauma in young children. Though too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, Kiel exhibited signs of confusion and anxiety. At night, he cried inconsolably, and during the day, he often clung to his foster caregiver. He began to fear loud noises and became sensitive to sudden movements, common responses in children exposed to traumatic environments. The Department of Child Services ordered a full psychological evaluation. Experts determined that while Kiel had likely not witnessed the exact moment of Seren's death, he had been exposed to long-term emotional neglect and instability. He showed signs of developmental delays likely caused by chronic stress. Plans were put in place to provide him with long-term counseling and a stable, nurturing home. As all of this unfolded, Callia remained in custody. Her demeanor never shifted. No pleas of innocence, no breakdowns, no public statements. Her silence spoke louder than any confession. Prosecutors began preparing for trial, building their case with a combination of forensic evidence, psychological assessments, digital records, and financial documents. The charge was first-degree murder with intent and premeditation. What began as a mysterious death had now become a carefully constructed case. Every lie, every online search, every cold decision was now part of a timeline that led to the loss of a young, innocent life. And as the story unravelled, the real horror lay not in the act itself, but in how calmly it had been planned. The trial of Callia Morgen began on a cold January morning, nearly a year after Seren's death. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back row, sketch artists hovered near the front, and members of the public sat in heavy silence, waiting to see how a mother could stand accused of such an unthinkable crime. The prosecution entered with confidence, their evidence painstakingly laid out in chronological order. They were not there to paint Callia as a monster. They didn't need to. The data, the bruises, the journal entries, and the autopsy spoke louder than any dramatic argument could. They began with the autopsy, methodically walking the jury through the science of suffocation. A medical expert explained how Seren's injuries were consistent with manual smothering, not an accident or medical emergency. The sedatives found in her bloodstream were enough to make her drowsy, but not enough to kill her on their own, which indicated she had been drugged and then suffocated while still alive. A chilling timeline emerged. Callia had put Seren to sleep, possibly even tucked her in, and then waited until her body went limp before using a pillow or her own hands to end the child's life. Next came the digital evidence. The prosecution projected search histories, forum posts and insurance documents on a large screen for the jury to see. They emphasized Callia's late-night searches, how to make someone unconscious, child smothering deaths, life insurance claims. They showed that she had deleted these searches shortly after Seren's death, a move prosecutors claimed was an attempt to cover her tracks. The journal entries delivered a deeper blow. Excerpts were read aloud, the courtroom silent except for the prosecutor's voice, echoing Callia's own words. "Sometimes I look at her and feel nothing," one entry read. Another, more disturbing. "If only I had just one child, maybe I could fix this mess. She's the weight around my neck." The impact on the jury was immediate. Several members visibly recoiled as the prosecution built their final argument. This was not a mother driven to madness in a single moment. This was a woman who had thought about it, researched it, and then followed through. Callia's defense team, though experienced, had little to work with. They argued that Callia had suffered from untreated postpartum depression and extreme emotional stress, exacerbated by financial troubles and isolation. They suggested she may have experienced a psychotic break or dissociation, but no formal diagnosis of psychosis had ever been made. Psychological evaluations concluded that while Callia displayed signs of narcissistic traits and depressive episodes, she was fully aware of right and wrong. She could make calculated decisions. And she had. The most devastating moment came when a social worker testified about Kiel. Though he was too young to speak about what happened, his trauma spoke for him. She described how he had started drawing only with dark colours, how he avoided anything resembling a bed or blanket, and how, whenever someone mentioned the name Seren, he froze and stared at the floor. The implication was heartbreaking. Even if he didn't fully understand it, Kiel knew something terrible had happened that night. After nearly 3 weeks of testimony, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty of first-degree murder and child endangerment. Callia sat, motionless as the verdict was read, offering no reaction. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town of Fairbridge slowly tried to move forward. Seren's grave became a place where people left small stuffed animals and handwritten notes. Her former teachers planted a tree in her memory at the local elementary school. As for Kiel, he was placed permanently with a foster family who adopted him a year later. He would grow up away from the shadows of his past. His name eventually changed, his story kept private, but for those who followed the case, the memory of it remained, not just for its horror, but for its disturbing clarity. A mother had planned her daughter's death, blamed her own son, and nearly got away with it. And in doing so, she didn't just take one life, she shattered 3.